Good evening and welcome to the 412th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series on comics, animation, illustration, and other text image work. It's funded by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation and the New School. And our guest tonight, up in one of the boxes, is Glenn Fleishman. Uh, Glenn Fleishman was one of the last people trained as a typesetter in the 1980s. He has a degree in graphic design and spent 30 years as a freelance technological journalist. In the last decade, Glenn shifted to printing history and produced 4 books examining aspects of the past and present, culminating with how comics were made, published in October 2024. He has an enormous collection of flong in his home in Seattle, and maybe I'll explain what that is in this talk. And his talk tonight is entitled Newspaper Comics Production in the Era of Mechanical Perfection. So take it away, Glenn.
Thank you so much. And good evening and good late evening to everybody. Thanks for having me as part of this long-running series. I'm very excited to be here. I've been going through the backlist of this symposium, learning about all kinds of things that I never knew about. So I'm hoping to add to that body of knowledge. My presentation comes from the last several years of research and writing I've done about the history of printing and newspaper comics reproduction across the long span of metal relief printing. And I will have so many examples of this to explain everything I'm talking about. In the course of this research, I learned how efficient and glorious the newspaper printing world was at its peak, how sophisticated its operations were, and how rapidly art and type could be created, transformed, and put on paper. And so this talk is really, I want to celebrate that bygone era and also surface the ocean of tradespeople and craftspeople involved in this transformation, most of them invisible to the reader and often to the cartoonist, to the editor, and sometimes, maybe very often, to the syndicate producing comics. Today, of course, vastly fewer people are required, and there's 100% less lead involved in producing newspapers. Oops, I've got to hit the right button to advance. That's the other problem. There we go. So this chunk of this work comes from my book, How Comics Were Made, that I kickstarted last year and published and distributed. And this talk is adapted and expanded from some of what's in it. But the nice part about doing a live talk is I can share not only more images than I could fit in, but also film snippets, many of which come from these great historical sources and really help show you the sequence of things that happen, which is very hard unless you make a flip book to really match. So when I talk about the mechanical perfection this time, I want to start briefly with a couple of quotes from a book from 1946 that blew my mind. I found it through a reproduction of an image at Guy Lawler's Legion of Andy site in his discussion of Ben-Day dots and comic screening and coloring, and I tracked down a physical copy. It's an accounting by the director of art and reproduction at the New York Times for a hunk of the first half of the 20th century. This guy, Ben Valjean. And he spent decades lecturing to advertisers and production people about how to prepare material to appear in the New York Times. And so his 1946 edition of Advertising Production is an incredible snapshot of the state of the art of that period. I digitized the book because it had fallen out of copyright through a lack of renewal, and it's at the Internet Archive. So you can find this, and I have a physical copy, which I actually pull out for reference because it's so wonderful. But the version online is has all the information in it. And so I just want to read 2 quotes from this book because I think it will illuminate what follows. The first is this one. On a Saturday night, when we are printing the Sunday paper with this many sections, we cast as many as 6,000 plates. No wonder then that the newspaper office is a vast foundry. In the plant of the New York Times, there are 100 slug casting machines with a capacity of casting 8 tons of metal per night. The stereotype department may cast 45 tons of metal every night and about 150 tons on Saturday night. To cast 6,000 plates, each weighing 50 pounds in just a few hours, is a tremendous operation. It gives you a sense of the scale of what they're doing. And all of this metal is melted down and reused for the next day's production or the next edition sometimes. And in this quote, the Times allows itself 15 minutes from the time the last pages are locked up in the composing room, page one, and the inside pages to which its late stories jump, to press printing time. During those 15 minutes, the matrices are molded, sent down to the stereotype department to be packed. The plates are cast, shaved, trimmed, cooled, and placed on the press. The press is started and the paper is printed, collated, folded, and cut, and sent up a conveyor in finished form to the delivery room, all in 15 minutes. And 15 minutes after the first newspaper leaves the press, we find that trucks containing bundled papers have moved a half a mile through dense traffic to a train terminal. So this is blog level turnaround. You hit post, and 30 minutes later, people in Grand Central are reading that update on the front page of the New York Times. And this is in 1946. So I think this sets the stage because we always think the past is somehow slower and more ponderous, but with enough people, with enough mechanical perfection, you could do a lot. So, because this talk focuses on comics and comics production, we have to, of course, start with the line. Everything starts with the line, right? And by the 1950s, every role between the cartoonist and the printer was well defined, involved specialization that had matured over more than 30 years, more than 50 years in some cases. So let's start with that line. The fundamental unit of printing is solid colors, black as the sole color in most cases, or the base or key color for multicolor printing. Here's some handsome gentlemen from the Chicago Tribune, some footage here of them actually drawing these lines to demonstrate to the viewing public in a kind of newsreel format. The Chicago Tribune put out a few different movies called Trees to Tribune that showed the entire stage of production from cutting down trees through cartooning and everything else all the way to the final work. Uh, Here we see some Gasoline Alley, one of the longest running strips, still being drawn, just drawn by hand, an old Buster Keaton. And so it's as true in the early days of newspaper cartoons that we have to start with this line as it is for print production today. Now let's just skip ahead. Once you have the line, you move to the next stage, which is etching. So in the metal days, you have to take a line and turn it into a printable surface. And etching is the first stage in this. Once the strip is drawn, it's photographed. It has to be sent to the photograph department of a newspaper or syndicate, and it goes through stages. I'll show multiple examples of a lot of things just so you can see it more clearly. In this stage, they're taking a picture here of a cartoon. This is, in fact, a Bringing Up Father from 1940, and the photographer has the original strip up on the wall there. If you can see, it's a little photo's a little out of whack, and it's taking a large format negative print of it. In these days, photographic print, negative uh, receiving material was literally poured on as an emulsion. So the photosensitive chemical was poured onto a plate, and after you made the negative, you'd actually literally peel it off. So they'd peel it off, cut it up, and then it would be handed off to somebody in the photographic department who would check quality. So here we see people with a light table, two different operations that left the New York Times in the 1940s at Wright, pouring engraving. And these are halftones, so they're examining the dots, they're looking for quality, they're looking for issues. I've not found a cartoon, an image of a cartoon going through this particular stage of the negative phase, but all cartoons, all illustration had to be turned from any kind of continuous tone, any kind of artwork, original work, into something that was a black only negative. So you wonder, why am I showing chemical plants here? Well, there's a lot of chemistry in the printing plant, and an amazing amount was handled by hand. And as you note, people working without gloves, without respirators or any kind of masks, and often without good ventilation. But that was happening those days. So here, this is the preparation of a zinc plate, because zinc was one of the most common uh, metals used to create the plates that were used to produce this raised line that you needed for metal production. So from left to right, they're washing a plate down, then they're pouring a photosensitive emulsion on top of the zinc plate, and then spinning it in this tank. I'll show you later some video of that spinning in order to coat it evenly. Under high intensity lights, the negative is contact exposed to the zinc plate. So it's placed into this apparatus, which is a vacuum or at least compressed surface. So the plate is on the bottom part with this photosensitive part up. The negative is placed on top of it. It's locked into a frame. And in this case, they set a timer, and high intensity light pans down or exposes all of the flash. to transfer the exposed parts of the negative, the clear portions, to burn those into the plate for the next stages. Uh, Here, this plate's being fixed because, or sorry, being developed rather, because the image is still latent. It has to be developed and brought out and then fixed on the plate, scrubbed to clear off the remaining emulsion and leave just the image. And then this is the greatest term besides flong, which I'll explain in a moment. In order to then turn this flat plate with an exposure on it into something with a raised form on it, representing the lines and patterns in it. The plates were brushed with dragon's blood. It's really dragon's blood. That's the name. It's a kind of resin that was used to brush. You brush in four directions as a whole process. It's baked, which you'll see in footage in just a moment, and then it goes through a sulfuric acid etching bath. Each time it goes to the bath, that's called a bite, and plates were bitten four times to get the relief high enough. The background, the non-exposed parts of those zinc plates through the negative have to be lowered successively, and they can't be lowered all at once because you can't remove that much metal at once. So this is this iterative, time-consuming process. Finally, after the plate is fully exposed, it is routed and excess metals removed, and often many times multiple negatives were exposed at once into one zinc plate, so they had to be cut apart into pieces. So this is someone routing it apart, and you wind up in the comics world with something like this. And this is a zinc plate of the Wizard of Id. And you can tell it's zinc. I've handled enough plates now. You can tell by the sort of color and the feel. And there's magnesium is also used with a slightly different process. And I don't find it as commonly used in newspapers, but magnesium plates have a very different texture to them, different color. And so this is it's a hard metal plate, and you can see routing around the edges where it was cut out and ready for the next stage. And now we will watch a little video, which will help explain this a little better and narrate. Go. Here we go. I've sped this up quite a bit because otherwise we'd be watching it for a long time. So these are all the stages. They're making the plate, they're exposing it, they're cleaning it up, gets spun, it gets baked, then they're painting it with rosin, they're cleaning up details, they're opaquing out portions. So much going on, right? And then it gets it's dipping it, he's brushing it, it's going on that's like a grill, like a heater, cleaning it off again, biting it in the sulfuric acid bath, pulling it out, more processing, more examination, and then this example of like an over-etched dot, an undercut dot, and then a perfect dot. This is what they're seeking in that. Finally, washing it off, doing even more touch-up, working with a burnisher, baking the final result, scrubbing it off, more cleanup. There's an endless amount, right? And then finally, you get to the routing stage and the plates are done. This is all done. I've sped this up, I think, 20 times just so you can see the amount of footage, amount of steps involved. This is Horn Engraving is the company that made this film. It's going to be found on Vimeo and YouTube. You can find, if you search for Horan, Horan, you can find this entire film as well as a number of other films that show this kind of process. So now you're left with a plate. You've got a thing that's made of hard metal. It's got a raised line. Surely that's the last step, right? And of course, no, there are many, many more steps to come because we're in an exciting age. So the next stage is making mats, and a mat is a mold. It's just another name for mold. It's short for matrix, so you call it a matrix or matrices is the plural often. The old-fangled word is flong, Flong. Favorite word since I learned it in 2017. A flong was technically invented around the 1850s, and the derivation may be from a Swiss-French man who moved to England, and when his workmen would see him making, he was testing out, he developed this process of making molds from sheets of tissue and blotter paper interleaved with a glue and paste that would be hammered into a piece of metal or a plate of metal type. He would say, "Ah, my flong," like the French dessert, and they heard my flong, and that is apparently the origin of the word. So there was two kinds of flong. One was a wet kind from the 1850s onward, but in the 1900s, a new form was developed that would revolutionize syndication and newspaper production, a dry form. And I'll show a lot of this in just a moment too. Uh, I've talked to people who worked in newspapers in the 20th century, some older press people um, who worked during the days, metal days, and I'll say, "Did you call them mats or flongs?" And in the shops where they called them flongs, they said, "Oh yeah, there's other people called them mats." But in the shops where they called them mats, they would laugh at the term flong. It would like be talking about, buggy whips and things like that. The term seems so old-fashioned because we're in the modern era. You can sometimes find these discussed as ad mats or movie mats because if you go on eBay, you'll find things listed as mats because untold billions of mats were made to distribute molds to be used in newspapers. So let's look through how that worked. We can start with our good friend Kerry Drake, who in one of the strips from say 1940s, his strip within the strip was a cartoonist showing off to a seemingly suspicious fan. I don't know the whole story here. I couldn't find the story run, so I don't know what happens next. But he's explaining to the fan how comics are made, which is my favorite subject. And he says they make metal cuts of them, which are pressed into wet cardboard to make these molds or mats. And these are mailed to my 688 papers. They're not exactly wet cardboard. He's a little bit off, but not too wrong. And then the next step here at the newspaper, hot metal is poured into these mats to make the cuts from which the strip is printed. And his fan says, "Wow, am I thrilled?" Very, very good dialogue there. But again, I don't know. I think there might be a murder involved later. Who knows? Couldn't find out. If anyone has a collection of Kerry Drake and knows the answer, I'd love to find out. But so the so it was known among cartoonists in this era how this process worked. They would sometimes be sent flongs, they'd sometimes visit a newspaper plant. It was something that was kind of in the background. When I talked to folks who've been daily cartoonists for 50 or more years, many of them had visited printing plants or had some connection with it. So they had a vague idea and some a stronger one. Like Lynn Johnston actually flew, for better or for worse, she flew to Buffalo, where a lot of the printing of or engraving and printing of color comics pages were done in America for a number of years, for decades, until the late until 1990s. She went there to see the process and how it worked, and so she had her hands on it. So this is a flog, and this is the step that comes after making those metal plates. So this gentleman is actually taking the metal plate and putting it through a press, and the piece that he's holding up on top there that's bent, that's the flong or mat, and it starts as a flat piece of it's a kind of slightly cardboard-like, but maybe a little. It's kind of thicker than a index stock, but lighter than cardboard, and it's a consistent consistency throughout. Its wood pulp and filler. And I've never been able to find out exactly what the ingredients were. There were a few companies that made longs for the newspaper industry, and they didn't leave instructions behind about, here's how our secret process was made. But it's mostly wood pulp, and what it was very malleable. So under a press, sometimes these were put into a humidor or some kind of device like that to get a better to make them a little more malleable than they were by default. But under high pressure, um, these flongs were pressed against the metal plates to produce these molds. Um, I think, did somebody have let's check questions for a second here. Uh, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll keep that just handy in case there's questions come up. You can ask them in the chat, and I'll try to get them. We'll get them at the end. So here, this is following the production of Gasoline Alley in 1927, in an issue of Popular Mechanics, and the strip's been drawn, and now it's being made. It's made into a plate. It's gone through the etching stage. Now they're making flongs for distribution. The metal plate that you saw earlier, that would have been very expensive to make many of and distribute because it's heavy. Metal zinc isn't cheap even in those days, or magnesium. So in order to distribute comic strips, syndicates made hundreds of flongs. So a strip that was in 2,000 papers, they would make 2,000 copies of it, essentially a kind of 3D photocopy, right? Is they would take the metal plate, and that hard metal zinc plate could be used over and over and over again to make these paper-like molds that were then distributed. And you can see here's another view. There we go. Here's another view of the same thing. This looks to me, this is from a 1940 Bringing It Father article in Popular Science. I'm pretty sure this is also flong being made. They have the full page of the black color of a Sunday strip. Uh, and this person is pulling off flong where you can see the flong on top. It's flexible, and the metal plates that he just pressed against are at the bottom. I'll have some photos later and some video that will show how the flong was pressed a little bit better than this too. Uh, Oh, there was a question. Here's a great question. Oh, Val, hi, Val. Why didn't they just photograph the comic and send the photos to all the newspapers? Was that actually more expensive than sending the flongs? Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, I should update my presentation to include this in the future. What I showed you so far, there's kind of different stages of operations. And so big newspapers would have a sort of a zinc or a zinc production line, let's say, or a magnesium production line. So all those steps where I showed there's specialized people. They have the photographic production department. They have the people doing the retouching. They have the folks making, coating plates for negatives. They have folks coating zinc plates, the sulfuric baths, the routers. This is many different professions. And if you're running a big newspaper, the New York Times, this could be, I don't know, with multiple shifts, with 3 shifts and 7 days a week, maybe there's 150 people working in the zinc plant, like that part of the operations just to do, or the engraving plant, I should say more specifically, or more generally, the engraving plant just to make all that stuff. So it's almost like saying, okay, why wouldn't, I need to get a dye injection mold made. Why don't you just send me the CAD CAM file and I'll do it myself? I'm not trying to say your question's naive. It's very good. But that's kind of this thing. Is you're saying to a newspaper that would have received a negative and then had to go through this process. It's a huge operation for them. So instead, the choke point would have been it's much easier for the syndicate. So I'm showing you both a mix of in-house newspaper operations and syndicate operations. For a syndicate, it made most sense to work with an engraving house. There were many, almost every city in the country had one, sometimes many engraving houses that would handle routine matters for printing, for sort of booklets and brochures and local books and newspaper work and advertising prep for newspapers, all this kind of stuff. So it seems strange today, but it's kind of like the copy shop of the day. There were small print shops, but there were also engraving houses that did this. There were places that did electrotyping, which I'm not getting into today. It's a whole other subject, also used in printing. But you could find electrotyping houses in every city that were just doing this electrochemical operation that was used largely for printing. So the real reason is, so this great question is, not every newspaper would want to set up an engraving plant. Many did not have it, only the biggest did. And the syndicates would be trying to get this the fastest, easiest way possible to newspapers for reproduction. So they're providing the mold to take all this overhead off the newspapers because it's very easy for the syndicate, once they've made one plate, to then produce thousands of identical flongs. And oh yeah, so Paul, hey Paul pointed out, right, the syndicate sending flongs and mats assured quality control, so the dots were really consistent. Those etching guys at Central, I don't know who Central is, but knew what they were doing. And that's exactly it too, right? So you have all this expertise and quality control, so then they know what's going to the newspapers is in the most evolved and again perfect state. We keep coming back to my notion of mechanical perfection. Perfection. Well, so this is great. And thank you for bringing that point up. And so let me show you this next piece. Here's another short piece of the movie. This will show you in a little more detail how the flong was made. Because I think it's hard to totally pull together. Is you've got a metal plate, or metal plate, sometimes a full page of a newspaper, sometimes it's a set of comic strips, and they need to be turned into a mold. So let's watch this. In this case, they're doing a full plate, and I'll show more about that later. Put a piece of right, they get it lined up, they put a piece of flong on top, then they put felt and a piece of metal on top of that to provide some buffer, and then it comes out the other side and pull off, oh, in this case it's one piece, and there's the flong, and you can't really see it because some of the video is a little blown out. There's an impression that's now been made, an exact mold impression of that. I will show you, this is the gem of my collection, is something I bought off eBay. A person I don't think knew exactly what it was. They thought it was worthwhile. This is a what the at the time it would be what, United Feature Syndicate. No, it's it'll tell me in a second at the bottom. You'll see. This is sorry, Universal Press Syndicate rather. Universal Press Syndicate would send out, for instance, a sheet of Doonesbury like this. This is 6 days, Monday through Saturday, the black only installments of Doonesbury. This is 1973. This is the week that John Ehrlichman from resigned from the Nixon White House in the midst of early Watergate revelations. And at that time, Gary Trudeau was working 5 to 6 weeks ahead. And so these strips were in newspapers' hands and were supposed to run. And Ehrlich resigned days before they were supposed to run. So the syndicate scrambled. They had the newspapers run the next week of strips with modified dates. And this from the Hartford Courant, it's got a Hartford Courant written on it. It's the only reason I know that. Somebody saved it because they thought maybe it's valuable, and it thought, well, one in my hands. I have a chapter in my book about this, and Gary Trudeau was very generous and gave me some insight into his working methods and what he remembered of this period. And there's a video on YouTube you can find it about it as well. But it's the very interesting thing when you have an artifact like this, so it's a piece of random printing history. But it's also one of the only full sheets of flong I've found that's a full week of strips that's been uncut. Because usually they would wind up at the newspapers, they'd be cut into pieces for separate casting that I'll show you in just a bit, and then thrown away. They'd be burned or discarded long before recycling. Flongs were just gotten rid of. And so the stuff that survives is something that someone thought was important enough to keep, at least to show to other people or what have you. Um, so anyway, this is, I think, a real treasure that someone saved it, and this will go. It belongs in a museum, and it will be heading hopefully to the Billy Ireland Museum. Uh, and just some other examples, a little less precious maybe, but this is a full page. This is the black plate for a full comics page. We've got High and Lois, Hagar, and Prince Valiant all on one page. Um, We've got this is another strange thing I acquired. I acquired hundreds of four-color separated peanuts flongs from Sweden, and I don't know how they got there. They were apparently English language strips meant for a Swedish newspaper in Stockholm. That and Someone saved hundreds of them that didn't run in the 70s, and they wound up in a estate sale in a thrift shop, and then to someone who bought them, and then to me. And again, some of these are winding up in museums, some are in people's collections now, but this is the black plate of the famous Citizen Kane strip in which Lucy spoils the ending of Citizen Kane for Linus. And it's fascinating to look at because it's such a palpable thing. When you hold flong, you're holding the lines, you're feeling the lines as the inverse of raised surface. So it's one thing to feel a printing plate, it's one thing to look at a flat piece, but the flongs is almost like a braille version of the strip. So there's palpably something very interesting about them. There's another example. This is from the Schultz Museum collection, the Charles Schultz Library and Research Center. It's just another flong that wound up in their collection. Uniquely, it's hard to see, but on the far right, it actually even stamped with the name of the company that was making the flongs for what would have been Universal Features at that time, I think, for Peanuts distribution. So after the new syndicate made up hundreds or thousands of flongs, someone like this person right here would be packing them into stiff envelopes and sending them by train and mail and courier all around the country. And I found this little snippet in a great little industrial movie featuring our friend Al
Harry
Jaffe.
has just received one of today's comics in the mail. The cartoonist who drew it sells his comic strip to many different papers.
This is Al Jaffe's Tall Tales, a great format comic. It was tall, so people could fit it on the edges, so it didn't take up space in the regular comics page. Or if they'd squeeze the comics down, you could still get run. So just in the middle of this video showing how newspapers are made, there's this receptionist or office assistant receiving, going through the mail. There's the flong, and it's going off to the production department. All right, so if this wasn't enough, I've got more for you. We still are not at print yet. We still have a little ways to go on our journey. The next stage we need to talk about is Ben-Day inking, and I'm guessing by the kind of folks who probably come to seminars like this that many of you have heard of the Ben-Day process. Maybe you don't know exactly what it is, but you've heard the term. You've heard about excuse me, Ben-Day dots, and this is kind of, I found it one of the most difficult pieces of technology to untangle after the fact, because even though there's videos that show the process and descriptions, a lot of and there's even books about the Ben-Day process. A lot of this process, I feel like there was expertise that was taught that's been lost because there's nobody left who seems to talk about it. So they may be living Ben-Day people, but I think most of them stopped working in the 1950s, and there was a switch to photographic methods at that point. So everything up to this point has been about, I keep talking about the line, and I keep talking about black ink, right? So all makes sense when you're dealing with making a relief surface when it's just a solid line or solid shape with black. So how did you produce color in the relief era? And so complicated, but I'm going to try to tease it out. So uh, every artist knows, work with an ink pen, there's all these different techniques you can use to create tint and shade and pattern to give the impression to the eye or the sense of shading or differentiation besides just a straight line of outlines, things that newspapers favored. Newspapers favored the line because of the low quality of reproduction, but there's all kinds of things that can be done. And for instance, you've got a genius like Harriman, who on the left you see in one strip, he's using multiple different methods of expressiveness that are showing, their sort of tint and shape and form and rain. On the right, though, in that strip, if you can look carefully, I don't know how well it comes across, you see a regularly occurring pattern of dots behind 10 baby fingers and 10 baby toes. That certainly wasn't done by hand. And this is where we get to the Ben Day process. If you look at this Buster Brown and we zoom in, you see these regularly occurring dots in the past. And this is the 1910s, I think, 1900s, 1910s. So certainly no human being did those. These are Ben Day patterns. We got to back up for a minute before I get into how the Ben Day process worked, because I got to tell you how a Ben Day artist received their instructions to proceed. So it's still sometimes the case today, but it was always the case before digital color was developed and started to become a part of newspaper comic production, that there's a colorist. And sometimes the colorist is also a comic strip artist. Here, this is the colorist for Bringing Up Father in 1940, and she is marking up not a photostat, but a reproduction of the black ink for a Sunday page of Bringing Up Father, and she's marking it up with watercolors. This is black and white, doesn't reveal quite as well, perhaps, what's being shown there. Oh, someone said they lost the slideshow. Can you tell us in comments? Can you see it? Is that just Michael? Anyone can point out in the chat. Are you still seeing it?
Yeah, I see it. But
Michael, it might just be you.
hmm,
Holler if you can't see it, and we'll see what's going
I
on. Okay,
see.
everybody else. Sorry, Michael. I think it may just be you. Sorry. Uh, you might want to disconnect and try to reconnect for that. Here it's black and white. It's hard to see what's going on, right? So let's go to this Louis Dot it's comic, and you can see how the artist here, it's Bill Gross, how he or his assistant colored just the first instance of every element, right? So just the mother's dress is colored and then the rug and so forth, because you're just telling these are instructions. You're just telling the engraver, here's the colors I want, right? And later, it seemed like syndicates I think that they may have demanded, because it seems very consistent at some point, maybe by the 40s or 50s, that there's a full color. So every time a color appears, it's drawn in. So here's Charles Schultz, possibly in his own hand, possibly with one of his assistants who worked with him on just this aspect, of course, just the providing color to instructions, where he marked up or someone marked up all the different colors you wanted. And then you'll notice, if you can see it on your screen, that there are numbers here, and the numbers correspond to something I'm sure many of you will have seen. This is a color chart from Sullivan Graphics, better known as American Color, across much of its history. And a color chart has numbers that correspond to the colors that can be reproduced by newspapers, and that Sullivan Graphics slash American Colors engravers can reproduce themselves. They have to make these colors for the cartoonist. So let's zoom in here a second. And you can see there's a component here, right? So each of these numbers, if I look at 43 in the middle, is 40% yellow, 40% red, 40% blue, YRB. It's really yellow, magenta, cyan, but in newspapers, they often use red and blue instead of magenta and cyan as the color specifications. So how did this specification, how do we get from this guidance, the specification, to raised dots of the right tints? And here's the answer. Oops, if I can click right. It's the Ben Day process. Ben Day process patented by the newspaper man, Ben Day Jr. in 1879. And was originally developed for chromolithography, another wonderful word to just roll out of your mouth. chromolithography was the fancy printing of the day. It was using lithographic stones, multiple stones, one for each color, and sometimes 10 or 12 colors that were registered to align the colors. And Ben-Day process let the production people involved in chromolithography more rapidly apply tints and other variations. He had sorted that out ahead of time. This is Lawler's theory, rather, and I think it's accurate. And chromolithography was used to produce like playing cards, greeting cards, other kinds of printed items. It was very fancy, and it predates the easy printing of multicolor um, relief printing or letterpress printed work. It was very hard to do registered multicolor printing at any volume because it couldn't be done by rotary press until we get into the 1890s and we get the advent of color printing and comics and fashion and all the rest, as many of you know that history as well. So he created two unique things. One is the Ben-Day screens, which are sheets of celluloid covered with tiny raised hardened yet rubbery gelatin patterns stretched onto a frame. So you have a screen, right? The screen is covered with a regularly applied pattern, like a dot pattern, like a zipatone pattern. And those dots are adhered to the celluloid, so they won't come off, but they are ink receptive. And then he also created what's called most typically the Ben-Day apparatus or the Ben-Day device or something like that. I think apparatus is used a lot. It's an inking and drawing surface with a hinge in which to place the screen above the artwork and then hinge it down so that the dots can be literally painted through burnishing by the Ben-Day artist onto the zinc plate that's being used for reproduction. Okay. Let's move on. Here we go. This is the Ben-Day apparatus. I have never found, I think, like the perfect illustration of it. So I'm going to show you a few. You can see here, this is kind of the artist's setup. Is you can't see the screen yet. That's the lifted up part of the top. You see the, or I'm sorry, that's not correct. I beg your pardon. The screen is down, so you can't see how it's mounted. There's a screen on top of a surface where a plate is mounted, and there's burnishing equipment on either side, there's rollers and other kinds of burnishers. If we go to the next piece here, you can see a little better kind of how this works. It's actually a relatively simple machine, and there are dials all around. I'll show you the next one. It's even a little better. Each of these dials has a micrometer adjustment, so it can be moved in extremely tiny increments, literally fractions of the frequency of the dot pattern that's being used. So you can see here most clearly the hinge. The artwork is on the bottom there on the zinc plate. The screen has been inserted and mounted, and it's lifted up above it. So let me show you this video. This may help clarify what happens, and I'll kind of talk you through it, and then I'll show you a schematic version of it as well, because I think this is the hardest part to understand. Once you've got it, you're going to be able to explain this to other people. But let's look at this. Ben-Day. This is from the Horn video. So we start with the zinc plate and the reference color guide provided by the cartoonist. And this is a black and white illustration, so it's a little simpler. He's just applying gray tints to an art. So this artist is painting, and what he's painting is a substance called gamboge. It's a yellowish substance that's used to mask out the areas that will not receive a tint. It's water soluble. So now he's looking through his guide to figure out which screen he needs because that's been specified. Like the artist may have said, I want a 30% gray here. So he's digging around. Where's my 30% gray Ben-Day screen? Aha, I have found it. So he takes it. Now he's got to ink the back of the screen, the side with those gelatin dots using this two-handed inker, inks the whole screen up. And this ink is, of course, an oily substance, right? This is where we get to kind of the lithographic thing. Gamboge, water soluble, he's using for masking. This ink is not water soluble, it's oily. You can mount the frame, or mount the screen rather, into the frame on the apparatus, then mask off the area that he does not want to have any ink apply to at all. And with a small burnishing tool, he's now taking and applying, it's essentially painting, transferring the dots from the Ben-Day screen onto the unmasked areas of the illustration that needs the tint. When he lifts it up, there is ink covering the gamboged area, and he's making sure he's gotten good coverage there. So all the area where you see tint are the spots that he wanted to have tint applied, and the yellowish stuff can just be washed off. In this last stage, he's carefully washing off the gamboge, but the ink remains in place, as you can see. So that is the Ben-Day process. You transfer ink through mechanical rubbing, mechanical burnishing, essentially, onto the masked areas of a zinc plate. All right, that was a lot. Thank you for following with me on this. So I've got a schematic version of this that may be a little easier to follow. These illustrations are by Chris Philpott that he did for my book. Wonderful technical illustrator and great style, and based in part in some Horan. The images are from a Horan engraving from a book they produced about the Ben-Day process. So in the first stage, here we go again. This is a zinc plate. There's an image, a latent image that's been exposed, but it's not yet etched. So this is still kind of an exposed emulsion that can be used by the Ben-Day artists to follow what they're doing. Then they're painting gamboge. These are all the areas that should not receive ink, are all the yellowed areas. Everything that's white in that should receive some kind of tint. Flip the filter down, or flip the screen down on top, and then you use a burnisher here, just a roller, which is commonly used because if there's lots of area, to press and transfer that material or the ink off the Ben-Day screen onto the background. And then finally you raise it, and there's the ink is applied both to gamboged and non-gamboged areas, but whenever there's gamboge, that can just be washed off and you're left with the pattern. I hope I haven't lost everybody because I feel like it's a heck of a process. And I was just thinking about the many, many thousands of people trained in this and who did this over the years, and them trying to explain to their families, what do you do? Well, I'm a Ben-Day artist. What is that? Let me got half an hour, I'll tell you. And this was obviously a large scale process. This is another photo from this is John or Jan or John or forget which is Jahn and Olier, big engraving house, and these are all Ben-Day artists, all working with their apparatus on illustrations for advertising or other kinds of work, art books, things like that. Just a room full of people doing their Ben-Day process. Uh, and so the one thing I don't have illustrations of, but I think you can infer from this is so for each color. So let's say where you have that 30%, 40% blue, 40% yellow, 40% red. The Ben-Day artist for each tint, for each color that's marked up by a cartoonist, is painting and transferring dots for each of those color plates. There's 4 plates for cyan, yellow, magenta, black. Each plate has its own separate tints that need to be applied, and they're using these these formulas as they look. If Schultz had marked, color 48, they're looking at that. They're looking at the magenta plate, and they're transferring a 40% dot pattern to that. So much that these artists had to keep in their head, and they have to sort of pre-visualize what they're doing because they're working across 4 plates and they cannot see the effect of what they're doing until the etching stage is done later. So they don't, after the Ben-Day process is done, this all goes back to etching, and the Ben-Day dots are etched and all the remaining exposed parts are etched in order to produce that final plate with a mix of lines and now with tints, with patterns. They could be random patterns like the ones shown in that Crazy Cat, where they're just almost like a cloud of dots, or they can be screened regular patterns like you'd use with typical Zipatone tint. All right. Any questions here before I move on? I'm going to move on to the next stage, and then we're going to get to printing, and it'll all be over. I don't see anybody commenting yet, so we'll move ahead. All right. So stereotyping. So you're like, where are we at here? You told me about doing the photographic part, about etching, about making molds, about the Ben-Day process to make multiple plates to create, 4-color molds. Surely we're at the end of the journey, but not quite yet, because those molds have to be turned back into plates because you can't print from molds. You can't print from the etched versions because they're too expensive to do in quantity. You can't print from a mold. You have to cast the mold. And what you cast the mold as is called a stereotype. And so stereotyping, you're all used to the modern version of the word, but it actually originated in printing. I just did a bunch of fun words. It was coined by the French printer Firmin Didot in the 1790s as stereotypie. And he paired the Greek word stereos and the other Greek word typos, which means hard impression together. That was his neologism. And the French often called, confusingly, a stereotype a cliché because of the sound it made while printing. Cliché, 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 allegedly. They sometimes called it des planches solides, a solid plank. But in English, the French term weirdly took, and from the late 1790s, the process of casting a plate for printing from mold has just been called stereotyping. And that term was used widely through really the 1980s when it stopped being used in any kind of real production in most of the world. So you can understand how this became used as sort of a generalized term. It's you're stereotyping today. We usually mean it to say you're broadly painting somebody with the attributes we ascribe to a class, often in a derogatory manner, but was very common throughout the 1800s for people, and even into the 1900s, for people to use stereotype in this classical way as well. Uh, so the casting, a stereotype was cast in typically a relatively hard lead alloy. So lead, antimony, tin. Sometimes copper is used in lead alloy, but usually for typesetting. Um, Most of the production of material in printing shops was in lead. So zinc, copper, magnesium, other hard surfaces were used to make plates for which you made molds, or for plates that you needed to print a lot of. Type and images that were produced in this way, where they're distributed by mold form in flongs or mats, were cast in lead because the lead could be easily melted down and reused. Copper and other substances were harder. It was a more elaborate process, involved more people or stages to reuse. So here's a wonderful image. Towards the end of my research on the book last year, I searched so hard to find images of people actually working with comics. You can find tons and tons of images of people working with type and photos in this era. This is a stereotyper. Now, I don't have his name handy, unfortunately, but it's actually named I mentioned his name in the book. It's actually named in the caption for this photo. And he's working here. He's got four flongs, and they're labeled blue, red, black, and yellow in this photo. And these are the flongs for four-color newspaper production. And he's measuring everything because the next stage is he's going to cast these into plates, which can then be used to print to be for the next stage. It's not printing. The next stage isn't printing. I fooled you, didn't I? You thought the next stage is printing, but here, let's look at some stereotypes. These are it's the detritus. I always talk about it as like the flotsam and jetsam that's washed up from the journey that printing has taken. Is some people kept some things often very random, and so this, for instance, is the Joe Palooka from 1942, and notice it's backwards. Of course, it's mirrored because it's going to print right reading, so it has to be wrong reading to print the mirror. And for some reason, usually these are thin plates and they weigh very little. And the plates were mounted on a heavier block to get it up to the height necessary for all printing material, which is 0.918 inches in the United States. This, for some reason, was cast as 0.918 inches tall to the printed surface, which means it weighs, you pick it up and it's a big hunk of lead that someone cast. I never understood how that happened. This is the Doonesbury from the 1970s. It's Fred and his friend, the ambassador at the UN. You can see some routed out parts. Like often I found, even with the lead plates, they would route out portions that were empty to make it easier to produce the flongs and raise up the areas that were empty so they wouldn't collapse. It was harder if they were at a higher level. So you'd see some extra routing there. This is It Never Fails. I've forgotten the year on this one. Some of the old uh, gag strips, terrible jokes, and run in odd spots. Funky Winkerbean, let us never forget Funky Winkerbean. Just a random strip that, again, just washed up on the shores here. A Barney Google, same thing. Just interesting material that has survived. I think the plates have tended to survive more because they look like comics, and the molds I've found fewer of because I think people don't know what they are. I kind of expect that some newspaper people would take home material. They might take home a plate like this to their family, give it to the kids. It's lead. They're handling lead, but it's pretty inert. You're not, unless they're chewing on it, the kids are fine. But I'm showing all these materials to show these are all the individually cast comic strips that would be made from those plates, from the molds shown earlier, right? That were sent out by the syndicates. They'd cut them up and they'd cast each strip as a separate plate. So obviously, if you're casting things as a individual plates, you have to aggregate them once again. So we're almost at the end of the journey. Here are the comics, those plates I just showed you, being made up into a page. Again, another hard-won image. It's such low quality. It's the best form I could find of someone actually laying out in metal a comics page. And zoom in, you can actually, I think I figured out which comics these were, which day this ran. I can't see it right now. Um, then, once the page is made out, the entire page is turned into a flong. Earlier, you saw a piece of that, but you had to turn an entire newspaper page into a flong because of what comes next. So we've gone through now almost five transitions, right? We started with the line art. We go to negative, then we go to an etched plate, and a flong is made from that to distribute to newspapers. Newspapers get that, they cast as the plate. Now we're making flong from that plate, and there's one more stage to come. Here's an example from my collection from a full page flong. I've got a few examples of full newspaper pages of comics pages, and this is one of them. Zoom in a little bit here to see. So bringing it father. It's always bringing it father. Um, from this stage, they would take the full page flong and they would cast it in a special device. They would bend the flong in a semi-cylindrical shape and then cast it to make a plate that could go on press. And the good news is, hey, I've got some more footage to show you. This is again speeded up. This will show you the whole process from page makeup to the final plate that goes on press and printing. So this is the last piece of our situation. So this is the page being what's called locked up. Here's the flong of the entire page being made. Guys leveling it there. And I puts the flong in, puts the sheet, puts the metal plate, runs it through the flong press, of which I think there may be one that survives in the world. I have a lead on one, but I don't know if it's working. Takes the flong off, the flong, lost girl. This is people putting a felt on the back to hold up the parts that are blank so they don't collapse during casting. They put it in a machine to bend it. Then it goes into this device, which is the casting machine. Hot lead pours into this thing, instantly cools because there's cooling jets behind it. They pull out this plate, which weighs about 50 pounds, 40 to 50 pounds, and it has to now have the edges trimmed off. These machines automate most of the process. There's still a little bit of a hand operation. This fellow goes through and just kind of cleans off the edges because this is how it's mounted. He paints a one on it, meaning it's the front page, and then this conveyor belt takes it niftily up or down to the press room, and it gets cranked onto the press, locked in place. A little bit of OSHA guidelines there, and they start running the press. They take a look at the slow run. Once it's running well, they take it up to full speed, and finally, the newspaper finally come out. Um, we're at the end of the journey together, folks. And so what you see so that's done. There's the newspaper coming out. But it goes on its merry way to Times Square and beyond. Uh, extra, Lost Girl. And so this is very excited about this as well. I was able to acquire one of what I believe are the only surviving uh, comic stereotype plate. Uh, I think there may be one or two others. I haven't been able to get pictures of them, and it's partially broken. But zoom in here a little bit. This is the full. Mine weighs about 40 pounds, so it's broken. So some pieces of lead are missing, but it's a big honking hemisphere, and I've got that again. It's going to go to a museum, um, and that is the end of this process. So what comes next? Well,
It's
of course,
going to be
Piero
50,
LaGuardia
50.
reading the newspaper, reading the comics aloud.
Okay? Then maybe you'd like some more of your laundry torn to pieces. Rip! She's ripping her laundry there, a little delicate piece of lingerie.
This is, as of course, a Fiorello LaGuardia reading the comics during a newspaper strike during his era as mayor of New York, and a family from the World War II photographic archives, family reading the comics at home. And just to close off the book side of things, so I produced a book last year called How Comics Were Made, still available in small quantities until the end of February. And then in June, Andrew McNeil Publishing will have How Comics Are Made with essentially the same contents, but they thought people in bookstores would think the active verb would help more, which I agree with. Slightly different cover. So if you want to get a copy of the book, it is available from me now, and you can find it in bookstores in a few months. Pre-order it. And if you have questions, you can find me at glenn@glennf.com. You can find the website at howcomicsweremade.inc. And there's my personal site. And I'm going to leave this. Ben, I'll take this off the screen, right? I should stop sharing.
Yeah, so
But
we can see you larger.
all right,
Great.
there we go.
So yeah, if you have any questions, you can
I know how to go through fast through 100
yeah.
years of printing history. I think Howard had a question. He said, "What would typically happen to plates, molds, and so forth? Seems like a lot of significant metal pieces created for a single use, basically one day's paper. Would they be melted down and recycled?" I have a short and long answer to that. The short answer is all the flying was burned or thrown into the trash because it had no value and there was no recycling that I'm aware of. I don't think even the flong companies wanted it back. It was very funny. At one point, I came across a company called the Wood Flong Company, or the Wood Dry Flong Company, and I assumed wood was the substance. The family's name was Wood. It was the Wood family's dry flong company, one of the big manufacturers. But I never found any information about them wanting to retain and use it for any other purpose. And the lead, all the lead was melted down at the end of every day. And as soon as they're done with the stereotypes, they'd take them off. There's another part of the stereotype operation. They melt it down. They use skimmers to take off any of the crud on the top, and it would go right back into the vats for casting the next systems. The longer story is I was at the Type Archive, this magnificent resource in London that's now shut down. Unfortunately, its stuff is in warehouses. Sue Shaw, who's one of the founders, is an editor and letterpress printer and historian. She said she's giving me a tour of this place that of all the historic British monotype operations and like the entire British history of casting type and printing types and everything. And she said, "Oh, well, of course, they burned all the flong." And this was 2017. I had no idea what she was talking about. I made a mental note. And later I was like, "Oh, they burned all the flong. They burned all the flong." So she was telling me when I'd asked an unrelated question. And I've heard this since from other people who worked in papers too, that uh, it's the sad thing is a lot of wood type was used at one point in newspapers. And when larger size metal type could be cast, or the style or the habit of using larger type, like large wood type, fell out of practice, it was just stowed in the back room. And I had multiple people tell me, like, "Yeah, my dad used to come home, my grandpa would come home with all this beautiful hardwood metal type, and we just put it in the barbecue and light it on fire and burn with it, or we'd like, heat the house with it." You can find some houses have been insulated with flong. Um, People will pull off the siding on their house and they'll find old newspapers and be confused, and they will call around, or they will find. I have an article about flong called "Flong Time No See" on Medium. People will find that, and I get an email every 1 to 4 weeks from somebody who has found flong and they don't know what to do with it. And often the answer is, "Oh, I don't know either," but sometimes interesting things. But it was definitely, I found some ads as part of, it didn't fit the comics history angle, but I found some ads in the 20s to 40s in the newspapers where they offered to sell you their used flong at a very cheap rate to insulate like your hen house or outbuildings. So it was definitely a thing. We'd be shocked if there aren't tens of thousands of homes and buildings out there where there's flong somewhere there. It's just hidden away. Uh,
Hmm.
Julian asked, "Are flongs durable enough to be used as rubber stamps?" I'd say not really, because they're the kind of substance they are. They're pretty bendable. It's kind of, it's not flubber, but it is an incredible substance. That because it's just malleable enough to be formed under pressure into a mold, but it is not hard enough to really resist much. So it's kind of when it can be made into a mold and it's hardened. But I've got thousands of pieces of it of different sizes and shapes, and it doesn't really resist. Like, you couldn't press it onto something, you couldn't put a backing. You'd really want to cast from it. And I'd love to find somebody who would cast flong. I'm still looking. There's a lot of people out there with various metal operations, and I'd love to cast some flong. I work with a letterpress printer for this book project. One of our awards in the Kickstarter was Bill Griffith was willing to let me reproduce one of his strips as fake flong. So we did a letterpress print, and we used a, uh, a magnesium cast plate of one of his strips and pressed that. The letterpress printer used a nipping press used for book production, and wetted the paper, this really lovely rich paper, and pushed the plate into it. And so when you get the sheet, the top looks like flong and the bottom has a letterpress print. But that's the closest we've gotten so far to being able to do it. We used the plate that we made the flong from, we also printed from, which is, it worked actually pretty well. Thank you for everyone for attending. What's the next thing, Ben? People ask more questions,
Yeah,
or
if anyone
you
has
got
any other
questions?
questions.
Uh,
Uh, do you know how, I know printing was a highly unionized, at least in New York, and did that keep this technology around long beyond offset printing when they could have used offset
yeah,
presses and
absolutely,
stuff? But
absolutely, and in
it
the
was
UK
the
too. It was, but the fight was when. So offset printing weirdly was developed starting around 1900, almost by
yeah, I thought
accident,
right.
and right. So, but it took a long time. Like some German newspapers had switched over even in the 20s, but there was kind of like a there was a missing piece, which was the photographic element. So offset printing really requires you have standardized photograph, like consistent available photographic negatives that you can make, and you have to have a way of producing a layout on paper. And so it was a complicated, like there's some weird machines. There was a device you could get at one point where you could lay out your page in metal and then you would photograph it on this bizarre thing. And the photography would actually be able to sort of almost skim the metal to produce a negative that would only be what should be printed. So they were kind of almost like lighting it in a very peculiar way to make that a print, and from that you can make an offset exposure in a plate. So there were a lot of practical reasons that kept it used until the 50s at least. In the 60s, it starts to become more practical. You get CRT based of type, then you get phototype. It all becomes very practical in the 60s, and you start to see the emergence of photographic processes. So Ben-Day inking is replaced with opaquing. I'm sure, I don't know if anybody in the audience that did that, but like Durf Backderf did this at one of his jobs. He was working on a paper in Florida. I've talked to some folks who've done it, where you'd have acetate sheets and you'd use opaque paint to paint each sheet. Sometimes you'd be doing for like comic books, they would be doing Rubylith. You cut out the Rubylith opaques auto acetate sheets to correspond to the percentage tints that were then shot by a photostat camera. So that process all replaced Van Day, but it's still for a long time the unions had a lock on the printing side, and they would strike and would bankrupt the paper. Right, the New York Times was beside itself at one point because they said we needed to switch to the next thing. The union said you're going to shed 90% of our jobs. What are you going to do for us? And in the end, one of the greatest deals ever made between newspapers and unions happened, which is the Times agreed to to guarantee jobs for life to all the printers working, or pay them out a really early retirement and whatever. It was a really good deal because most of the printers by that time were quite old in relative terms. Old. I'm sorry, I'm in my 50s and 60s, even 70s, because they hadn't really been training and bringing up new people. It was kind of a union job, it's a lifelong job, but it hadn't expanded. So a lot of those guys, hundreds and hundreds of them, took retirement right away. There were like 700 or 800 people who qualified for this. Some of them kept working for a while longer. There was a multi-year transition to CRT type, phototype, offset. Eventually, those people retired or moved on to other jobs. The last guy covered by this deal joined the New York Times at I think age 16. He worked until 2016 under this arrangement, and the last thing he was doing was laying out ads in InDesign. He continued to be. He wasn't feather bedding. He wasn't paid not to work. He was always constantly retrained every 10 or 15 years in a new job, but that was the last printer. But that was really the thing. And then, the Docklands struggle in the UK when Murdoch literally built a secret offset phototype photographic production division on the Docklands and then told the printers, like, sorry, you didn't give me terms. And so I'm going to lay all of you off. There were 6,000 people, and I think they needed about 10% of that. And he broke the unions with Thatcher's backing. So some of the technology you needed to ripen, but by the 60s, by the 70s, papers could all have converted to offset, except for a combination of also the investment in infrastructure to change over their relief letterpress plants to offset, but also unions threatening to strike for it could strike for years because it would take that long to do the transition.
I see Paul has a question in the chat about technical. Can you see the
Hmm.
chat? Um,
Oh yeah, it's Paul said, I'm missing a step, maybe missing a step, but was the flong matrix put on the drum and then cast with liquid lead? Yeah, I may have a better photo of that. Let me see if I can also just be able to pull up the image in the um let's see. yeah, this might, let me see if I just bring up this one item. Here we go. Let's share that. So if you can see there, I can't see the flong so well there. The flong has been is put into a form. It's locked up against the machine, and the lead pours in, and then they pull it out. The flong is discarded, and the lead plate remains. So the flong is put on the drum, and then the lead flows into this kind of closed system. It happens really fast. I've got various footage of it and photos, but it's a very quick process of loading it and then removing it. And Julian said, "Oh yeah, suggested visit for late August, visit the Hamilton Wood Type Museum in Wisconsin, then the Wisconsin State Fair to see the newspaper museum. That's great. I've been to the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, about 90 minutes north of Milwaukee. I've been there for two Ways Geese. Ways Goose is the annual printers celebration, and they do a nice conference event. So that's a fun thing. But they do classes and tours, and they have the largest collection of wood type, and they've got enormous presses and posters, and you could learn to print and see exhibitions and so forth. Worth a trip. Oh, Paul said, so this is the step I understood. How could the flong survive? I've looked into this. The temperature of so lead melts at, oh gosh, I have the temperature in my book somewhere. It's like 500 something degrees, I think, Fahrenheit. Forget what it is. The flong could withstand it for the brief period of time. The flong is made of some kind of wood pulp in the filler that was just resistant enough to temperature that the lead would pour in, and before it could ignite, there was no oxygen in the system because the lead would fully fill in the void. And then most of these systems were water cooled, so water would swoosh in behind the form. The lead would cool at air temperature very rapidly anyway, but with that much lead, it took that. So the water cooled system meant that it was just a brief moment of exposure, so the flong would not ignite. I have examples of flong that were both cast and uncast. So I have a lot of examples that were never used; they're fresh, right? And then others that are, I've got a couple like from I think 1918. It's probably the earliest example that I've got. And it was clearly used because it's kind of fried. Like you can see that it must have been exposed, but it's still intact. You can still make it out. I don't think you would cast another page from it, but I think it survived pretty well. Fahrenheit 451. Yeah, exactly. But also Fahrenheit 451, but it's like you need, but it's oxygen, it's heat plus oxygen. So I think the oxygen, I don't think I've talked that through for. That was probably the key thing. But plus just that very brief exposure the difference between the lead temperature and the Long's ignition temperature is very small. So it would have had to be exposed for longer, I think, to actually cause a fire. I've never tried to set Flong on fire, so I'm doing an experiment. How does Flong burst? I'll do it outside. Don't worry.
Everybody else. Yeah. Um, I think it's interesting when you can look at a period of print technology, like we were talking about photo typesetting. When you look at it now, you see this incredible distortion on the lines of type.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, if you compare this high speed printing, newspaper printing, with a 19th century four color chromolithograph, you see that. And I think it's why people like it because it is so crude. The color, that little detail you showed us, out of register color, clotted.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's not. Someone looking at it historically would say this is the fall, the ruination of printing. It's mass produced, high speed, and really,
How could it ever work though? Is the thing is you think about it, it's I've counted seven generations of reproduction from the hand to the printed page, maybe eight,
right,
depending on how you count it. And I'm like, how do the lines survive? And the answer is not always that great, right? Like if you look at a newspaper
yeah,
from 1920, sometimes you're like, it looks like it was printed with a potato, as an old design
yeah.
teacher of mine would say. But sometimes it looks awfully good, and you're thinking,
Well,
you
we
look at
got
newspapers in the
yeah.
1950s.
Well, that's an aesthetic of mass printing of high speed reproduction that people like
Mhm.
now. That's why all these people now are playing with those risograph
Oh
machines,
yeah.
that's going to reproduce low res Band-Aid dots and things like that. So people like that look, not this perfected four color printing or more than four color printing.
I did have
So
somebody ask me
fascinating.
once about the registration issue because if it's four color and you're making flongs from different things,
Yeah,
I mean, between the photographic distortion, the physical distortion, materials, whatever, how would they ever register? And I got a chapter in my book about work closely with the Schultz Museum people and the folks at Billy Ireland to help me find multiple examples of certain peanut strips and you compare them in some, again, it's the potato printing, like the San Francisco Chronicle in the 1970s. Those press people knew they were all about to be fired and they had given up. That's all I can say. Because you look at it and
really
Charlie Brown's
did.
face is like a livid red and it's like over here, it's registered off. Like they did not care anymore. They knew they were all
Yeah,
going to lose their jobs, I have to think. But the some other newspapers you'd find like Newsday, New York Newsday, and you look at it and you're like, this registration is perfect. All the lines are perfect. The colors are so good. And they're using the same technology, but they had figured it out, even though all the odds were against them in the generations of reproduction.
yeah. Kind of amazing to look at that. Yeah, I did a lecture years ago about halftone printing in the Yiddish press and why so much of it was so bad.
Oh yeah.
Almost they printed books with illegible halftones. They're just a blur.
Hmm.
There's just a caption. Without the caption, you couldn't figure out and press gain. It's also on newsprint, so there's a lot of gain, uh,
Yeah.
So anyway,
This
it's
is
fascinating. Uh, the inks.
Somebody asked, how do you make a flong? Well, I will refer you a little bit to the earlier. Oops, did I just do something here? Oh no, it's now. The You make a flong with pressure. That's it's like how
Yeah,
do you make a diamond? Pressure and time. And to make a flong is really it's just a flong is an imprint. It's a mold made under pressure with a relief surface. So um, I don't know the last time flongs were made. There's a guy down in the South who's bought an old show press, one of these places that did posters and stuff for circuses and touring bands. And he's got some equipment. He's got some flong that's never been used. He has fresh flong. And I'd heard some noises from him. He was going to try to make some new flong, but some new flong molds, but have not heard since. Little obscure, right? One thing when I was researching my book is I actually want to know how comics were printed today because I hadn't been on press with a modern newspaper. So I called around my area and a kind of regional press said, "Oh, sure, you can come out on a Sunday. We'll show you." And they bought some old press equipment. It was offset. And, but they could print, I think, 24 or 32 pages, sections at a time. And they're printing their 8-page comics for a bunch of different newspapers that they speed throughout the Northwest US. And there are two guys working the entire operation on the Sunday. It's like two guys and like another guy making plates for it. And it was just it was the guy the manager told me, the plant manager said, we're talking about newsprint and quality. It's like, well, because of cost, we've had to go from blank point to blank point. I forget, it's a paper measurement. So the paper was they had to keep going to thinner and thinner newsprint so that the opacity would be worse, the printing would be worse. And then here's the kicker: when the book came out, I wrote this production coordinator and the plant manager and said, "Hey, I'd love to get you copies." That entire operation has been shut down. So this is a regional paper. They had just set it up a year before. It's gone because newspapers. It's very sad. Um, Someday I hope to track them down and thank them again because they took some great pictures of modern newspaper printing. But that's that's part of the subtitle or the subtext of my book is like, for all this history, it may all be going away too.
Anyway, I don't know if there's any
Happy
other
to
kind
talk
of
about.
technical issues. Yeah.
Anybody
So
have more questions? Anybody left? People, I see some faces. Anybody want anything else I can tell you about this? You've
paper.
answered everybody's questions.
Yeah. Yeah, there was um yeah, I think that even in the offset printing world, there were all these plate makers downtown in Manhattan. And some of them were good, some of them were slipshod, and they made really bad, using Kodak halftone screens. They were really bad. Their screens were dirty. So it's I mean, you have to have a lot of technical craftsmanship to keep this thing working. Otherwise, it's just too many points of disintegration, and it can get really bad. Yeah, as you
Yeah, it's
described. Yeah.
for fun. I sometimes, if you watch on YouTube, you watch something that starts feeding you more of the same thing, and so I'll watch a video. Oh, here's a video about like a modern newsprint press, and I get to see there's some incredible technology. I mean, today's presses are just outrageously automated, and it's reaching a new height of mechanical perfection. But it is that kind of thing where it's like two people can run, something the size of a giant ship's worth of press now. You just don't need that many people to run them anymore
Mm.
because there's so little that human involvement is required for. Most of it's automated or it's, I was on press with a book. The summer before last, and these folks had a pretty modern press, but they still had to go up and kind of the ink was fed with like this oscillating thing on the top and so forth, but they had to still go up and feed that manually and whatever. And then I was on press a few months ago and like a few years more modern, and they're like, "Oh no, we've got this stuff fed in through like we don't go up on top there anymore. We have it all fed in automatically." Oh, okay, this is the true future today. This is what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of videos, industrial videos of new presses, and they're really sophisticated
It's
monitoring
fun.
ink coverage and things, and they use ink. Those are offset, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
but but it's fascinating how everybody grows up in when we were in a print world, everybody grew up at a certain moment or a certain period of printing and sort of took that's printing.
Mhm.
And then,
I grew up in the silly putty era where you could actually still use silly putty to get an impression off the paper until they changed. I think they
yeah,
went from lead to soy inks or something, or the drying
yeah, it
process
didn't come off.
changed, and
It
suddenly
wouldn't come off.
you couldn't
Yeah,
come
yeah,
off anymore. That's how old you have to be as the silly putty
I
text.
remember that.
yeah. That
What a
ink.
great time. You pull
Anyway,
it and stretch it in every direction.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's mechanical, highly mechanized. I mean, the process you were showing us, but I guess just through the complication of it built in all these weird imperfections that are sort of nice
Hmm.
to see now. Um, Kind of interesting how you how people think about reproduction. Uh, Maybe they're right. If you work digitally, you're seeing the same file. So maybe it's not.
So
I don't even know if you call it reproduction anymore. Just passing a file, looking at the file. Well,
oh,
we're
it
talking
is.
about monitors, calibrating monitors, so they
Mhm.
all the image looks the same. That's sort of what big issue now. Of course,
It's kind of eerie though when you get something. I found it with this last book is when you get something on screen, and I always kind of expect things to be different. There'll be problems, it'll shift, whatever.
some gain
But
of
the
some. Yeah,
thing on screen is so close to the final product I got. It's almost it actually hurts my head a little bit because I'm so used to factory. Well, you're going to have this much ink in or this much spread. It's going to be. It's like no, it's all the registration. I used stochastic screening. It's
yeah,
a modern
very high.
process, right?
Yeah,
And it's tiny little specks instead of halftone dots. It's frequency, and under a loop you can see them, but it's almost invisible to the naked eye. And the color
yeah,
fields are great. And so they're pulling sheets off the press, and so I'm pressed this, and I'm looking at this, and I'm like, "Why is your registration so perfect?" And they're like, "There's all these cameras in the press, and there's this," and I'm like, "I think that's 1/80th of an inch off." They're like, "Oh, let's just, it's." I barely I feel like in the past I've had to spend a lot of time talking to people about registration or pushing it like they couldn't, the plates morph, they twist on the press, and now um, the systems are so self-reinforcing, there's so much feedback involved in the production that it just was. I mean, it was great, but I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to be on press. In fact, but it was fun to be there anyway. It's just everything came out perfectly.
Yeah, and
It
not
was
much was
like pretty.
no change from the first pages to the end of the run. Very consistent
No, it's all
coverage.
they even this place I went to does sheet fed printing, which is a little old fashioned these days, because web based, this
Yeah.
roll based printing is much more affordable. But they have a device that lets them put a web in the back, a web of paper, and it cuts the pages into sheets as they go. So they get the best of both worlds. They get the sheet fed quality and sort of tweakiness you can do by printing in a sheet, but they get the price affordability and of web. It's anyway, it's the future. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll see where this goes. Um, the printing world. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having
Thank
me on
you. Yeah,
this.
it
It's
was
a
great.
thrill.
Yeah, we've
It's a
had
thrill to be here. Thank you.
Thank
Guy
you. This
Lawley.
is awesome.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah,
Okay,
very good
Pleasure.
session.
thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to talk to people interested in this obscure topic.
Yeah. Is the
Although
American
part of my goal is
Printing History
to
Association, that's still going, isn't it? I assume it's still
hmm
going.
hmm
It's an
Yeah,
interesting group.
I'm trying to, this is part of my goal too, is to get more people interested in this a little bit of an obscure area because I feel like there's a billion artifacts. Well, I shouldn't say a billion. There were like billions of artifacts out there, most destroyed, and now there's small set. And so I keep trying. I put the word out in part because people will find things and go, "Oh, this is what this is. I should keep this, or I should donate this to the." Billy Ireland Museum or to my university's comics collection. Columbia has a great collection. Yale has all the Doonesbury stuff. There's the Schultz Museum. Will take material that's Charles Schultz related. So I've got some of my collection. Like now that I've written the book, is going to various museums that will have it, so other people can study it too.
Um, Okay, great. Thank you. We'll get the word out.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody
Thank
for
you.
attending. This was a great audience. Great
Thanks,
questions.
everyone. See you all
Yeah.
next week. Take care.